Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Sasha Turner, who is at Yale as a visiting fellow at the Gilder Lehrman Center for the study of slavery, resistance, and abolition at the MacMillan Center. She is an associate professor of history at Quinnipiac University, where she teaches courses on the Caribbean and the African Diaspora, women, piracy, colonialism, and slavery. Her research has been published in the Journal of Women's History, Slavery, and Abolition, and Caribbean Studies. Today, we'll talk with Professor Turner about her new book, Contested Bodies, Pregnancy, Childrearing, and Slavery in Jamaica. Welcome, Professor Turner.
Thanks for having me.
Let's begin with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
So my book is a history of the ending of the transatlantic slave trade, and this is a slave trade to the British colonies. And I focus specifically on the trade to Jamaica, or at least the impact of the ending of the trade to Jamaica. It's a really complicated story. There are many characters that I have to keep track of. So there are abolitionists who are mostly campaigning in England. There are British parliamentarians. There are lawmakers in Jamaica. There are slaveholders who I sometimes refer to as planters. And of course, there are the enslaved people, enslaved women and children. And so the book is really a study of conflicts among all those characters over how the slave trade ends. A lot of us are familiar with the process of the ending of the slave trade in the British colonies, and there's a debate, a lively debate among historians about whether or not the slave trade ended for humanitarian reasons or economic reasons. My book really doesn't talk about that much. It has implications for that debate, but the conflict that my book talks about is really the proposal that abolitionists made to end the slave trade, not immediately, but for a period of 10 to 15 years. So abolitionists came up with this idea where they said, well, you know something, the abolitionists of the previous era from the 1760s to about the 1770s tried to abolish the slave trade before, but they didn't succeed. And they didn't succeed because they wanted to end the slave trade immediately, and that didn't work because obviously the slave trade was very profitable, and there were many in England who were very well connected and very wealthy who supported and benefited from the slave trade. Right. And so the group of abolitionists who emerged in the 1780s had understood very well, they had learned from the previous abolitionists of the 1760s, that if they came out to demand an immediate end to the abolition of the slave trade, that it was unlikely to work. So they came up with this very elaborate plan. And the elaborate plan was, you know, what if we propose ending the slave trade or continuing the slave trade for another 10 to 15 years, and during that 10 to 15 years, we would encourage planters just to shift their dependence from the slave trade towards reproducing the population locally. And the idea was that planters depended on the slave trade because the local slave population in Jamaica did not reproduce naturally. And they came up with several arguments why the slave trade did not reproduce naturally. They said the sex ratio between men and women were imbalanced. They said slavery was so horrific in terms of the working conditions, in terms of the living conditions of the enslaved, in terms of the kinds of work that the enslaved were required to perform, and of course the punishment in terms of how they were treated. And so abolitionists said to the planters, you know, what if you were to improve upon those conditions and will allow the slave trade to continue for 10 to 15 years while you improve the condition, while you continue to import enslaved people to balance out that sex ratio. And so, you know, they had these wonderful ideas on how they would, you know, end the slave trade. But of course, they didn't consult with the enslaved women, right? And the enslaved women had very different ideas, one, about their bodies. They had a very different idea about their lives. I mean, first and foremost, most of them rebelled. So resistance and rebellion is a continuous theme. And so we have this long tradition of enslaved people having very different ideas about their lives, having very different ideas about their bodies. And so obviously this whole idea of reproducing the slave population locally did not sit well with these enslaved women. So that's one of the conflicts that the book talks about. The other characters that I mentioned, the British Parliament, the local assembly in Jamaica, they also didn't necessarily agree with those ideas. The planters, for example, or the local slaveholders rejected the idea that they had any responsibility at all in the local population not reproducing. And so they said, you know, well, it's not the labor conditions, it's not our punishment, we're very kind slave masters. And so they had a different set of ideas. They pointed finger mostly at the enslaved women as being responsible for the failure of the population to reproduce locally. And so what my book actually does is that it goes through and charts those various conflicts between enslaved women and planters or slaveholders on the one hand, abolitionists and parliamentarians on the other hand, and the implications of those conflicts for the lives of enslaved women and their children, of course, the larger community in which these women were existing. So it's really a study in conflict and the meaning of those conflicts for the lives of enslaved people.
And what led you to write the book? What was that inspiration or catalyst?
Well, I think if you talk with most historians, it's often very difficult for us to pinpoint one single thing, one big aha moment, you know, that lead us to write a particular book. It's often a combination of factors. But I think if I had to choose one factor, it would be a letter that I had uncovered. I had discovered this letter written by a local agent, a plantation agent. We sometimes refer to them as attorneys, who were acting on behalf of absentee employers or absentee owners of the plantations who lived in England. And the tradition within Jamaican slave society is that those local attorneys would write letters to employers in England detailing and giving reports about what was going on in the colony, the ways in which they were managing the plantations, the ways in which they were treating the enslaved people. And so I found this letter written somewhere around 1804 from this local agent in Jamaica to his employer in England. And in this letter, he detailed the ways in which he was changing around the labor responsibilities of enslaved women. So in one part of the letter, he explained that enslaved women who were pregnant would not work on their own. They would work in groups of 3. And by placing them in groups of 3 to say lift canes to the mill, this would allow some women to rest while others worked. So he was punctuating their labor with rest period. And when I saw that, it struck a note with me, and it struck a note with me because I sort of read it through the lens of several historians. So Jennifer Morgan, Kathy Brown, Vereen Shepherd, they all have sort of written about history of slavery and the body, and just, you know, the body in general, and the ways in which, you know, the body sort of isn't just this thing that we write about. It is this thing that forces us to respond to it in certain ways. And when I saw that letter that talked about the ways in which this local agent was responding to a woman being pregnant and changing the labor roles to respond to that pregnancy, it got me thinking about, you know, what these other historians had written about the body of enslaved people and what that actually meant in the context of slavery. And the other thing that that struck me about this letter is I also remember sort of reading in the literature this idea that the plantations were gender blind. So slavery was gender blind, so men and women did the same work without any attention to differences in gender. And that was quite the opposite. This letter was saying something very different. It was actually saying that this local slaveholder was in fact paying attention to women, so there is a distinction between men and women. But more than that, he was also paying attention to these women being pregnant and changing the labor, at least how he was organizing labor around pregnancy. And so that sort of encouraged me to dig a little bit deeper to find out, you know, was this simply a unique case, or were there other experiences or other kinds of examples that I might be able to uncover? And so that letter essentially took me down the path of what essentially became contested bodies.
Okay, and let's talk about your the research that you found and your methodology.
Well, most historians, again, will tell you that any history of women, particularly histories of enslaved women, is painstaking research. And so I spent years in the archives. I think it took me maybe about 10 years to write this book. I spent a lot of time in the archive. It's a deeply archival book. And in some respects, I am lucky. And I'll say lucky because the women that I'm researching, they're existing at a very unique moment. And this unique moment, as I stated earlier, was a period of abolitionism. And one of the things that the British Parliament did when abolitionists started to campaign against slave trade is to convene a series of investigative committees. And these investigative committees, held primarily by the House of Commons, would invite folks from every aspect of the slave trade and slavery to come to the House of Commons and answer or, give testimony to account for was slavery really as horrible as these abolitionists were charging. So you had ship surgeons, sailors, captains, traders, doctors, planters, so just about everyone who had any kind of dealings with either the slave trade or slavery appeared before Parliament to answer questions. And so one of the essential sources that I've had to rely on, and one of the sources that gives me quite a bit of detail on these women, are actually these parliamentary records. They asked a lot of questions about, what kinds of labor were pregnant women subjected to, what kinds of punishment. Were there any specific kind of allowances given to them in terms of increased food rations, in terms of increased clothing allowances? And so these questions and the responses became a very rich set of sources. But of course, all historians again will tell you that their sources are inherently biased. And the kind of bias that I was working with these sources is these planters obviously are in trouble, or they're in some amount of trouble. They have to prove to the British Parliament that, oh, those abolitionists are, making up story. They're not telling the truth. They're really making unfounded charges. And so the particular kind of bias within these sources is that the planters would exaggerate the extent of their benevolence. They would exaggerate that, oh yes, we're actually, making life a lot more bearable for these women. And so yes, on the one hand, these slaveholders did in fact make some changes to women's lives and women's living conditions, but I had to figure out how truthful were they being, how extensive were these changes? And so I had to counterbalance out those witness testimonies by using other sources. So some of the sources that I would look at were the private correspondence. So that same letter that I talked about that got me involved in this project was one of the kind of sources that I used. So private correspondence between local agents in Jamaica who were writing to employers in England, as well as, if you may, more objective sources. So these are plantation inventories that would list the number of enslaved people on a particular plantation. It would list the number of children who were born at a given time, the number of individuals who've died. It also lists the general work log. So, how many enslaved people are on a property, what are the work that they're involved in doing. And so it's painstaking research because you sort of want to get as close as possible to the reality of these women's lives. And one of the other sort of challenge that I had to deal with is none of these sources were actually written by the enslaved women, right? So it's all these slaveholders, parliamentarians, it's their perspective that we're getting. Nothing in the first person. Nothing in, you're right, that's right, nothing in the first person from these enslaved people's perspective. And so what I had to do in the book is to put it at the front and center to say, well, these are the perspectives of the enslaved people, and this is my best guess at what they might be thinking, what they might be getting at in terms of how they're responding to the slaveholders. And so it's really, painstaking archival dig that I had to go through in getting this work done. Did you come across any women's voices at all? Clearly, obviously not women who were enslaved, but any, the wife of a plantation owner or any other kind of woman's voice was heard in the research, or was it predominantly male? So yes and no. It was predominantly white men's voices. There are some white women that I haven't covered, so planters' wives, the governor's wife, the governor in Jamaica from 1803 to I think 1804, his wife sort of, has this journal that a lot of us historians have relied on. So there are occasional records from white women that I've been able to access as well. And the interesting thing is that it's very difficult at times to tell differently the perspective of a white male planter from the perspective of a white woman, of his wife, because their economic interests in the plantation, in slavery, their ideological support of slavery were pretty much identical. So it was really very difficult to disentangle a white woman's perspective from a white male's perspective. In terms of enslaved people's perspective, unlike the American experience where, for example, they've been able to rely on the WPA narratives, we don't sort of have a similar set of sources for the Caribbean. Though we have, for example, the narrative of an enslaved woman named Mary Prince, whose owners had taken her to England, and then she was able to escape to abolitionists and then tell her story to these abolitionists. So there are these occasional sources that we're able to rely on. But I'm very careful in my work not to sort of use one person's story to tell everyone else's story. So even though there are times when I pull on Mary Prince's experience, I try not to use that to generalize and say, well, Mary Prince thought this, Mary Prince experienced that, and so it must be true for other enslaved women. I try as much as possible to think of these women as having very diverse experiences.
Okay, let's, you know, it strikes me when you were talking about the first report that went back to England, talking about how he, the slave owner or whoever was managing the plantation, grouped these pregnant women together. And my immediate thought was, it seems like he would have had to do that if he wanted them to continue working, because depending on where they are in their pregnancy, how much work can a pregnant woman really do of hard physical labor? My guess would be not a lot, and you know, it's very difficult for the women. So my next thought was, what did you come across in your research any means that plantation owners or slave owners took to not have the women slaves get pregnant? Because it probably slows down on production, and also costs them extra in food and clothing, as you had pointed out.
That's right, that's right. So that is an interesting question, and that's sort of the crux of the book. And I sort of go through and explain that the 1780s to 1834, which is a time period that my work sort of centers on, is a moment of change. It's a moment of change for several reasons, one of which is before the 1780s, before abolitionists came up with this elaborate plan to end the slave trade by way of getting these women to reproduce the population locally, planters really were not as invested in reproduction. And they were not as invested for several reasons. One, they calculated, as you've said, that, you know, it was probably too expensive because they would have had to provide for some kind of allowance for women during pregnancy. They would have had to have extra rations for children. And even these children who were born, it would have been at least several years before they would be viable laborers. And so a lot of planters before the 1780s were not as willing to invest in caring for pregnant women, in caring for enslaved children. And in some respects, as I had mentioned earlier, this is partly why historians have said that the plantation regime was gender blind, because planters were not as attentive to differences as it pertains to sexual differences, as it pertains to the different needs of childbearing women. And so there is a degree of accuracy in making that argument, but this changes in the 1780s. And the change is that abolitionist agitation, interest by the British government, and of course by 1807, when the slave trade does in fact comes to an end, planters quickly realize that the kind of neglect and inattention that they had given to childbearing women before the 1780s, that could no longer continue. And so now was a real moment for them to take stock of how they had treated enslaved women in terms of the kind of labor roles that they were given, in terms of how they would be punished. And so this is sort of a real moment of change that we're seeing in terms of, you know, enslaved women's experiences on these plantations.
Okay, let's talk about some of the conflicts that you had mentioned earlier. Just give a couple of specific examples, if you would, please.
So that's dangerous when you ask historians for examples. Historians can talk forever. I think one of my favorite conflicts that I talk about in the book is the conflict between doctors and enslaved midwives, healers, and enslaved women. So one of the things that slaveholders started to do in the 1780s is they started employing doctors. These are white European doctors who are coming out of England mostly, and in some cases Scotland, to the colony, to Jamaica. And they hire them for a number of reasons. They hire them to attend specifically to pregnant women, but they also hire them to attend to the general health care of the plantation. But the interesting thing is that before this period in the 1780s, there might have been 1 or 2 doctors in the Caribbean. Most of the healthcare practices were actually performed by enslaved healers. And so when these white doctors came out to Jamaica in the 1780s, and especially by the 1800s, now seeking to take over healthcare on the plantations, the enslaved healers said, wait a minute, you know, this was my territory, this was sort of my domain. And so they didn't simply just roll over and allow white doctors to manage childbirth and to manage healthcare. These women sort of resisted the idea of having now these practices under the control of white doctors. But even beyond that, these enslaved women who were pregnant would not willingly give over the care of their bodies to these white doctors. Remember that this is very much a racialized social order, and so whiteness sort of came with this so the white doctors were seen as allies of the planters.
Sure.
And so enslaved women didn't trust those doctors. So even though at times there were conflicts, I do talk about conflicts between doctors and planters who had very different ideas about how to treat childbearing women, the enslaved women didn't trust these doctors either. And so they, one, refused to be treated by them, and then the healers and midwives who were part of the plantation system before the coming of these doctors also resisted these doctors coming in and essentially taking over. So I'd say sort of that might be my favorite conflict. And to think of a specific example, they had these debates about whether or not infants should be bathed, and if infants are allowed to be bathed, should they be bathed in hot water or should they be bathed in cold water? And enslaved women insisted that, you know, infants should have bath. You should bathe the infant because, you know, bathing them was an essential birth ritual. And they would use warm water, and the warm water would be infused with rum. And the doctors had a very different idea. First and foremost, Europeans had a long and checkered history with bathing. They had superstitious ideas that bathing would sort of cause the body to deplete either its warmth, it would cause it to lose its humoral balance. And so they had these prescriptions to say, oh, you shouldn't bathe, and if you did in fact take a bath, only certain areas of the body should be washed. And so there was this clash between enslaved healers and enslaved midwives with European doctors who were coming, one, with very different ideas about bathing and also different ideas about bathing infants. And so one of the biggest clash that I talk about in my book is about the approach to bathing both the pregnant women as well as enslaved children. So I think that might be one of my favorite examples of, you know, the kind of conflict that is taking place on the ground with enslaved women and these European doctors who are coming into Jamaica.
So what do you ultimately conclude in your book?
So I make several conclusions. One of the conclusions that I make, and I think I started by talking about the abolitionists, one of the conclusions as it pertains to that aspect of my book is that the abolitionists did not have the freedom and equality of enslaved people in mind. It wasn't their central objective. The central objective of abolitionists was to protect British imperial interests, British colonial interests. And the reason I make that argument is that if abolitionists were first and foremost concerned with freedom and equality for enslaved people, then the moral outrage that they had over slavery, that would be sufficient for them to say, it doesn't matter if the slave traders will lose some money, it doesn't matter what the economic consequences of that loss might actually be. The slave trade is so repugnant, the slave trade is so inhumane that we require that the slave trade to end immediately. Instead, what they did was to create this very elaborate scheme to continue the slave trade for 10 to 15 years and to have women reproduce the population locally. And so what I do is to sort of make this argument that abolition was first and foremost about securing British colonial interests and less so about equality and freedom for the enslaved population. The other conclusion that I make is that this period is often labeled as a period of amelioration by historians. So they call the period between 1780s to 1834 one of amelioration. And we debate whether or not the condition of the enslaved person had improved. So, did slavery get better in its twilight years? And I sort of shift away from that argument, and I shift away from it because even where you might be able to see where enslaved women, for example, had greater access to food or had, a less demanding workload, what changed here in the period 1780 to 1834 is that there were new demands being placed on enslaved women. So the only reason that planters gave them more food or gave them more clothing ration or mitigated their punishment was to be able to harness their reproductive potential. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it's difficult to sort of get into this binary of better or worse, but to say that actually we're seeing the very parameters upon which slavery here was being built are actually changing during this period. So we're focused on the wrong thing to say, that slavery got better in the ending years. So I think those are the two major conclusions that I make in the book.
Well, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing your work.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
For more information about Professor Turner and her research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.